Good morning, everyone. I can see that we've got almost 200 students in the room here now. Thank you very much for joining us for this second lecture on the Understanding for Business Analysts module. So today we're going to be talking about understanding stakeholders. So I'm joined here in the room by Josh, who's helping me with a couple of technical issues at the moment. But I'm hoping we're going to have that resolved in a moment. Okay. I introduced myself last week, but I've got a little bit of a reminder of my background because I think it will help in the context of the topic we're exploring today, understanding stakeholders. So my background is that I spent many years in industry where I did a lot of facilitation work. So I would design and run workshops to support collaboration and co-creation. And these workshops, they might be directly supporting analytic work, they might be working towards policy and strategy development, they might be investigating performance issues or scoping out new projects, gathering data, working with external stakeholders, all types of output that we might produce from those workshops, but they were all about engaging with people, working to negotiate objectives, to evaluate options, and to make decisions. Within these workshops, I'd be in control of the process, but less so of the content, which may seem a little strange, but as a facilitator, my process would inform how content is presented and modelled, and how a psychologically safe collaborative environment was created and maintained. But the content would be produced and owned by the participants. So the untracked snow in my image here captures the idea that each workshop would be a journey of discovery that the facilitator and the participants take together. You will probably have worked out by now that I'm primarily interested in people and in qualitative data. And my second image is based upon one of my favorite academic quotes. Mason and Mitroff described wicked problems as being like the head of a hydra. You cut off one head, two more sprout, and suddenly the monster you're dealing with becomes even more scary. Operational research's response to wicked problems are problem structuring methods. That's one of my research interests that we'll talk more about next week. My final image brings us back to the importance of design. I talked a few moments ago about designing and running workshops, and again, drawing upon literature, the words here, appreciation, analysis, assessment, and action, they're taken from work by Brocklesby and Mingers, who identified different project or intervention stages or phases. Now, my work typically would support the initial stages of an intervention as we're trying to investigate, explore, and appreciate a situation. So we're working out the context that we're working with, the people that are involved, how they perceive the situation, and the questions that we choose to ask then inform the type of analysis that gets produced. Our shared understanding of different preferences guide the criteria and assessing the different options that are available to us. Ultimately, this all then works together to promote a collective commitment to act upon the project outputs or recommendations. So that's a little about me, and I hope gives insight into why I'm here at the start of this module, as we begin to understand in how we understand business as analysts, we think about stakeholders. So today we're going to ask ourselves, what are stakeholders? Why are they important? How do we identify them? Along the way, we'll also be thinking about what our attitude towards stakeholders is, how the choices that we make around how we deal with stakeholders, the purpose of our engagement, the level to which stakeholders actually participate in what we're doing, and how this drives the way that we communicate with stakeholders have implications for how inclusive and diverse it's possible for our work to be. And of course, different approaches to how we work with and manage stakeholders support different types of outcome. So let's start with a definition. The life support of clear thinking. Stakeholders understood as one with a vested interest. So what does that mean? When we talk about a person or an organization having a vested interest, we're talking about a personal or particular interest or reason for getting involved in that undertaking or situation. You'll notice also that some of these words here, collaborator, colleague, contributor, participant, team member, they're all quite active words. These are people with agency, people who are doing stuff. And we don't always recognize that agency in stakeholders as people with whom we can potentially have two-way communication and perhaps experience two-way influence. Okay, so if I move on from this dictionary-based definition, I've got a couple more definitions for you here. So, an operational research view that stakeholders are persons, groups, or organizations that must somehow be taken into account by the leaders, managers, and frontline staff. Okay, so that's about taking people into account, treating them with some sort of consideration, perhaps. Then we have a project management-based definition, people and organizations that are actively involved in the project or whose interests may be positively or negatively affected by the project. You've got a further selection of definitions in the readings that I've provided for you this week. And we're going to use the chat function now. Josh is going to help me out a little bit here. But on our small journey, thinking about stakeholders, I'd like you to type in very quickly why you think stakeholders are important. I'm going to give you 30 seconds and see what you guys come up with. Oh, lovely. So we're getting a lot of examples here. Common goals. Oh, it's coming in so fast. I'm struggling to read everything. They're affecting the implementation. Thinking about whether stakeholders accept what is happening. The value of prior experience, yeah? Providing the resources or having power over control of resources, yeah? Getting to know more about who would primarily be affected. Yeah, that's really speaking to some of the things that I was mentioning earlier. Important feedback. Helping to optimize. Experience, influencing. Josh, could you go back a little bit in the chat for me, please? Yeah, lovely. Thank you. Influencing some financial success. Suggesting what might help the organization achieve goals, controlling the resources. The action takers. Yeah, sometimes our internal stakeholders are the action takers within the organization. Okay. And if we can go back down to the bottom, please, Josh, to the most recent posts. Okay. Lovely. Corporate social responsibility is coming up. Yes. Yeah. Sometimes when you're working with stakeholders, it's very important to provide some sort of procedural justice. a very evident audit trail of when stakeholders have been able to get involved and offer their views, and the extent to which they are able to see how offering that view has actually influenced what happens. Lovely, we've got some great ideas there, and you may have noticed from the workshop slides for today that I'll be working with the content you provided and feeding that back in the workshops today and tomorrow. So if we move on then from what we have defined stakeholders as being and why we think they're important, often we leap straight into beginning to identify some of the characteristics of those stakeholders. I would imagine that many of you may have seen this grid before, the power interest grid, where we consider whether the stakeholders have high or low power, whether they have high or low interest in the situation we're addressing and in the project that we're undertaking. So when you use the power interest grid, for those of you that perhaps don't already know, you list the stakeholders affected or having an impact on the situation. You make sure that you include internal and external. You place them on the grid. So there you're mapping where you're going to put those stakeholders to recognise the power and influence that they have. The grid, and this grid in particular in the words that have been chosen here, gives an indication of how you're going to treat stakeholders in each of the quadrants. So suggesting that if a stakeholder's interest is low, but their power is high, you're going to be trying to keep those stakeholders satisfied. In contrast, if their interest is high, but their power is low, the suggestion here that you're going to keep them informed. And the process then suggests that you're going to develop strategies for managing each of those stakeholder groups. So doing this is going to involve the content I've put on the right here, implementing communication plans and monitoring stakeholder engagement and commitment. This might involve meetings, workshops, telephone calls, newsletters, surveys. But above and beyond anything, it will involve good communication skills. Now, let me just check. There's nothing else I wanted to say here. No, so that's the power interest grid. It's a well-known, widely used, and undoubtedly useful tool in many, many contexts. But as an analyst, I would always urge you to remember that all models are wrong and some are useful. So in the context of this model, I would ask you whether it was always appropriate that those with low power should receive only monitoring and information. Do these stakeholders have nothing of value to offer us through the way of two-way communication? If I were to show you this model again, you remember this one from the pictures I showed right at the beginning, this idea that within an intervention we go through phases of appreciating the situation, analysing the situation, assessing the options, the choices that are available to us, and then choosing what action we're going to take. And I would suggest that the way that we engage with our stakeholders shapes this process. It shapes the purpose of what we're doing. So we might ask, how inclusive is our process? And how is that inclusivity able to support diversity in our project outputs? Equally, of course, our approach to stakeholders might vary at different stages of the intervention. So we could ask, when should the stakeholder engagement begin? Often in the project management context, it's seen as something that is key to the implementation. But I would argue that actually it's worth considering right at the very beginning, almost before you've begun thinking about what it is you want to do. never mind actually implementing a change that people are going to receive into the business. We also then have to think about how do we motivate stakeholders to participate? Why should they engage with us? Perhaps for internal stakeholders, there are some very obvious answers to that question. Perhaps to an extent, they may not have a great deal of choice. But for some of our external stakeholders, how do we persuade them that actually they should give us some time to engage with us? And how might that participation evolve during the project? Here we might think about how we create a safe space for participation, how we support people to collaborate and contribute to our work, even if perhaps at the initial stages of the project, they're not quite sure why they should be involved. Perhaps they don't trust in us. Perhaps they are a little bit suspicious about why this organisation or this project team might be trying to engage with them. I would argue also then that the process, the progress and the quality of our work with stakeholders will influence the success of our outputs, as it really does influence how committed people are to action and to the implementation of change. A further spanner in the works might be the type of situation that we're contending with. Because it might be that we're faced with something that is a wicked problem. Rittel and Weber, back in 1973, labelled these problems wicked with the intention that we would interpret this label as meaning malignant, not benign, vicious, like a circle, a feedback loop, tricky, like a leprechaun, and aggressive, like a lion. Here we have some examples too. So I've taken these from a web article dating back to 2022 now, but some of these examples, human rights and inequality, water and energy security, refugees and immigration, these are very complex situations in which many strands are interconnected and many of the characteristics can be related to the people involved and the decisions made by people that are involved. For example, when we're responding to a wicked problem, there is no stopping rule. There is no point at which you can say, or you can be sure that you know all that there is to know, or all that you need to know about the situation. The problems that we observe are symptoms of other problems. So on the previous slide, I gave you some examples. And we could say, okay, we could make some links between biodiversity protection and climate change creating the need to protect that biodiversity. We could make links also to concerns or difficulties around refugees and immigration, perhaps related also to food security. And all of these we could relate to concerns around human rights and inequalities. So each problem that we observe is linked. And two academics way back in, I think, the 70s, Churchman and Mason, called this the global problematique, this idea that all these problems may be linked. If we go back to considering a few of these characteristics in more detail, we can say that there's no definitive formulation for a wicked problem. People will define the problem in different ways depending upon the perspective that they have. And because of that, we're not dealing with true-false statements about the situation, but about perceptions of what is good and what is bad. So the combination of these issues give rise to what Rittel called the demarcation problem. The challenge of placing a boundary or a scope around the problem that you are addressing. And in the context of this lecture, we would have to add the need to determine when we stop identifying stakeholders and how we negotiate the boundary of the problem that we are considering with the stakeholders that are concerned with it. So there's another little spanner in the works, and perhaps of greatest relevance when we are in the early stages of an intervention, just at that stage of appreciating the situation, thinking about how can we bring our analysis to bear in order to do something to improve that situation, and how do we ensure that the improvement that we make is an improvement in the eyes of all those stakeholders concerned, or at least having care in our consideration of which stakeholders are likely to perceive this change as being an improvement. So, these opening questions: what are stakeholders? Why are they important? How do we identify them? They've already begun to open up some of our thinking about stakeholder-related choices that we make as a part of our work on projects and interventions, as a part of our analysis or analytic work. So let's shift now to considering those stakeholders themselves. And I'd like to begin with a short video. I say short, it's about 3 minutes. Here we go. Okay, so I realised from the chat that some people were not able to see the video. It may be that you were accessing on mobile devices, but certainly if you wouldn't mind trying that link again between now and the workshop that you attend, and we'll try and get that working for you. This makes me feel like maybe I should give a quick recap of what was happening in the video. So it was a video that was associated with Danish television, and it was all about the differences between a group of people who were all Danish. And they were trying to separate the group according to their answers to different questions. And what we saw there was that the initial groups that people were placed in did. Sorry, I'm getting distracted here. Okay. We'll address the technical issues in a moment. Josh is telling me. So the initial groups that people were in were changing so that they were with different people as they responded to those different questions. So I'm hoping that it is a minority of people that weren't able to see that video, because I would like to ask the question, what further insight into what stakeholders are has been offered by the video? And again, if we could put that into the chat, please. Pause whilst I wait for some entries to start there in the room chat. What were your reflections on this? Okay, so I'm seeing loads of ideas coming up in the chat. I'm really liking some of these. You know, every stakeholder matters regardless of their interest or their preferences. There was, yeah, we might have more in common than we think. Yeah. Fundamentally, of course, the thing that we all share is that something has brought us together in the context of the situation in which we are interested. Yeah. There are links. Yeah. People at different levels of power can have common interests. We've got some really good stuff coming in here. Yeah. The importance of internal and external stakeholders. Josh, could we go up a little so I can see some of the earlier? Thank you. Yeah. Different groups of people can have the same interest. Everyone has a vested interest in something. Think about involvement rather than the power of the different stakeholders. Yeah, minimize the assumptions that we make about stakeholders and our preconceived ideas. Give everybody a chance. Yeah. Don't feel bad ever if yours is not one of the statements that I read out, because it's very difficult for me to see everything. But this is great that this has triggered some Some really good content here, thinking about, you know, what people's different needs might be. Okay, so for me, I didn't come up with a great picture, but for me, this video really underlines that fact that stakeholders are first and foremost people, individuals who may share different things with different subgroupings amongst the overall stakeholder set. Yeah, and I think the comments that you've made really sort of capture and enrich that basic statement about what the video was supposed to illustrate for you. So, when we're considering stakeholders then, these are some of the questions that we might consider. We might think, okay, what motivates a stakeholder's interest in your project? What are their opinions? What might their reactions be to your plans? What networks do they have? Perhaps somebody who may seem to have low power or low interest or both may actually have strong links to other stakeholders that do have higher power or higher interest in what you're doing. That really tips over then into the question of, you know, how might these stakeholders interact? Sometimes you can have groups of stakeholders, perhaps organizationally based stakeholders, that through your project might come together and have discussions that create a bit of an alliance between those stakeholders, and that could change the dynamics of your stakeholder group. One way that we might try and map some of this content is by using a stakeholder star diagram. So this is what I've got shown over here, this idea that you can think about the bases of power that a stakeholder or perhaps individual has. You know, what support do they have in relation to their interest in your project? And what available sanctions might they have if they're not happy about what is being done? In terms of their directions of interest, you know, how might they view your role on the project and your behaviour within the project? And how might their responsibilities and aspirations align with what you're doing? How might that influence the way that they think about or perceive your project? So these questions and this tool support identifying the most effective ways of engaging and managing stakeholders through your project, and to develop plans to achieve this. We might also consider the idea that when we're working on a project, it's actually a social construction. It's all about how people are working together to construct their perception of the problem and to respond to it. And we might think that sometimes when we encounter resistance to change, that's something that needs to be overcome, that must be combated in some way. But this work is quite old now, but these two authors, Waddell and Sohar, were suggesting that actually the resistance to change might be based upon rational factors. So whether it's based upon rational factors or non-rational factors, it might be worth trying to understand those. And if it is rational, perhaps there is a basis to think maybe we need to take this into account. Maybe we actually do need to make a change. If it's non-rational, we might think, well, it's non-rational, it doesn't matter. But to that stakeholder or stakeholder group, of course, it does matter. So we need to perhaps understand a little bit more about where that non-rationality has come from, what is driving or motivating it. There might be political factors which sometimes could be quite difficult to uncover if people perhaps don't feel that it's safe to put forward their true views. And of course, management factors might be rolled in and confused, entangled with some of those political factors as well. As we are experiencing change, it's typical that we might be going through this Kubler-Ross change curve. So sometimes we might, in terms of our morale and our feelings of competence, be quite surprised or shocked at some of the events that happen. But in our sort of morale and sense of competence, we might then be thinking, okay, I don't believe this. This is not going to happen. That we might be looking for evidence that it's not really true. It's not really going to impact me. Then we have perhaps frustration, the recognition that things are different, that perhaps there isn't a great deal that can be done about that. And maybe that makes us feel angry. Might also make us feel quite low in mood and lacking in energy, until we're able to begin experimenting and have some initial engagement with that new situation, such that we figure out or learn how we can work in that new situation, and begin to feel more positive about how that change can be engaged with and how it can become a part of our new reality. At the integration stage then, we have those changes integrated and we are renewed. I would suggest not only as ourselves, but also as a collective, because often in a change project or initiative, there are many people going through this change, and you hope perhaps helping some of their colleagues or their peers through that change when it's most difficult. Something that I couldn't not point out on this slide is that you don't necessarily go through this in a single sweep, a nice tidy curve. You might sometimes regress or slip back down into not feeling positive about the change that you're experiencing. And the other thing, of course, that I would have to emphasize is that I believe that how you approach your stakeholder management and how you introduce the change can have a huge impact on how smoothly people are able to progress through this change and move into a new integrated reality, accepting of changes. So we are then going to move finally into a review of some of the stakeholder tools and techniques. So we've already covered two. I do hope everyone noticed as we went through. We've already looked at the power interest grid, so where we list the stakeholders, we map them according to their power and their interest, heavily aligned to the idea that we're going to manage stakeholders, that we're going to communicate with stakeholders and they're going to receive our communications, receive the change that we're driving. I encouraged you to think a little bit more widely about whether stakeholder engagement might be productive if it were more two-way, irrespective of the level of power that some of these stakeholders had. And then we thought about the stakeholder star diagram, so beginning to try and uncover some of the directions of interest that an individual or organisation might have, and the basis of power that they have as they engage in that situation. There's another example that I want to share with you now that picks up on the importance of considering how stakeholders might interact, and that's called the sociodynamic energy grid. Okay, so here we are trying to think about the positive energy that stakeholder has towards the project and towards others working on the project, and the negative energy or the antagonism that we might experience or perceive coming from that stakeholder. Now, I'm going to flick on for a moment just to show you that within your slide pack, you have these definitions. what it means to be placing a stakeholder in one of these positions. So know that you have that in your pack. But for now, let's go back and look at this grid. And we have this golden triangle. From the name, we can guess that that's where we would like quite a lot of our stakeholders to be. That's the one where we have quite a lot of positive energy, but we're not absolute zealots. So we have a measure of sort of critical capacity, that we offer that sense of there being some critical perspective rather than simply a lot of energy pro the project. The zealots, that really is their drawback. Very positive, always in agreement. It might be, though, that those people who are so positively invested in the project, in the change that is being made, that they might struggle to understand the perspective of others, and perhaps struggle when compromises are made within the project. Right over the other side at the top, we have the schismatics, the people who are very positive and yet also very negative. That sounds a little bit odd, but it's almost as though they're oscillating between the aspects that they think are positive and the aspects that they think are negative. It perhaps says something about how they are expressing those views, as we can perceive them as being very disruptive and very challenging to work with. So it's constant challenge there, isn't it? To harness the positive energy, but also work with the fact that there is a critique going on there. A stronger, perhaps more valuable critique than you're going to get from your golden triangle, but also creating challenges for you to manage within your project. Then we've got the waverers, a balance in positive, negative, but perhaps feeling quite insecure about the change, perhaps, and not able to make decisions or to express very definite views of their perspectives on the project. Moving lower down the energy levels, we then have the passives, the moaners, the opponents, and the mutineers. What they have in common then is the low positive energy. And I think, yeah, the passives, they're just wanting to know what's happening and to be involved, but they're a little bit almost neutral in how positive or negative. The moaners then are more negative, and they're likely to be forward about expressing their unhappiness and making known their opinions. The opponents then are very negative, and they might actually work to project failure. Yeah, so very difficult to challenge their view that this is not going to a good place, that they're very anti your project and anti the aims that you're trying to achieve there. So very difficult to change the opinion of those opponents. And finally, then we have the mutineers, most challenging of all, the very negative, very actively disruptive, the people that may try to lead the project in a different direction. And I would say in that situation, you really do need a strong team response for how to manage that level of negative energy when it has so little positive energy allied with it. Those particular stakeholders might absorb a great deal of time. Okay. So, as I said, you do have the classifications for that sociodynamic energy grid there. But for now, I'm going to come to the summary. So our stakeholders are those with vested interests. We've said that those vested interests must be taken into account, considered in some way, because of their active involvement in the project, or because their personal interests may be positively or negatively affected. We've said also that our stakeholders vary in their power and interest, and we've challenged whether that necessarily means that we focus upon pushing communications out to those stakeholders. We've talked about how our engagement with stakeholders might vary depending upon the type of situation that we're attempting to improve and the intervention phase that we're working on. So when we're thinking about the initial stages of a project or intervention, we might be seeking engagement in order to have stakeholders really play a key role in helping us to shape and define the objectives of what we're trying to deliver, before we move into really pinning down those questions that are going to drive our more detailed, perhaps quantitatively based modelling. That, of course, is going to help us to draw out the understanding of perspectives and preferences that could help us in terms of assessing the different options we have, making choices about what we do, and we hope increasing the extent to which people commit to that action and are collectively engaged in making the project a success. We've thought in some detail really about how stakeholders have agency, so that finding out more about our stakeholders and being sensitive to the perspectives that they have can help us to manage stakeholder response to changes that we might be proposing. So, my final plea to you in this lecture hour is that I would like you to, at this stage, oops, can I move on? I'm not able to move on. Thank you, Josh. Lovely. Okay, so we have the usual QR code. And of course, this week it's not a test. This week there is a deadline. I have to admit that I cannot remember the deadline off the top of my head, but it is listed there in the MyWBS pages. So if you're able to use the QR code, or if you can't use the link, to have a go at the stakeholders quiz. Remember, please, that this does count towards your participation marks. We'd like you all to be getting really good marks on that. But most of all, we hope that through these quizzes, it helps you to sort of review your learning and secure that in preparation for the assignments that you'll write later in the term. If I can move on. Yes, I can move on this time. So thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions or pressing questions that people might want to put into the chat. I think I have one there that I'll look at in a moment. I do also just want to draw your attention to the fact that we have references at the back of this pack. Okay, so I'll go back to the questions that are in the chat, but in the meantime, I'm going to leave that up there in case anybody wants to make use of the QR code. Okay, so we have a great question here. How can we integrate the socio-dynamic energy grid framework with the other two frameworks, and what are the strategic applications of the resulting informational classification? Okay, that's a big question, Catalina. I'm not quite sure where to begin with answering that. So I would say that your socio-dynamic energy grid is something that you're not really going to fill out until you know your stakeholders a little better. So you might begin with your power impact grid as a sort of rough categorization of some of the stakeholders that you have relatively early in your project. You know, you barely need to know the outline of what you're going to be doing to be able to think of some of the stakeholder groups, some of the key individuals that are going to be really important to your project. Then as you progress and you begin to know more about your stakeholders, the stakeholder star diagram can be very useful to refine your understanding of really what is the basis of the power or your perception of the power that stakeholder has. And how can your understanding around their direction of interest influence the way in which you engage with that stakeholder? Then the sociodynamic energy grid is really coming into its own as you get to know those stakeholders better. And I would say that whereas often we put stakeholder groups on a power interest grid, and we might think of a stakeholder's organizational affiliations when we think about the stakeholder star diagram. With the sociodynamic energy grid, that's quite an individual thing. You might have individuals in the same organization working in the same type of roles that are on different points. Sorry, I'm trying to go back to my diagram. So you might have two people, same level, same organization. One is a zealot, another's a waverer. So it becomes much more about your management of individuals, I believe, this sociodynamic energy grid. Having said that, when you think about your stakeholder star diagrams, I also would like to link that back to the video where we think that actually, again, this supports the idea that within an organization, different people may actually have different perspectives. You know, they may be broadly aligned with an organizational direction, an organizational goals. They may have sort of professional standards that they hold very, very close, and they have a high level of integrity around maintaining those professional standards. But there is still room for those stakeholders to be having a very different perspective around, can I go backwards? Around their direction of interest. And in terms of sometimes the knowledge that stakeholders have, if we consider knowledge being power, sometimes within an organization, individuals might have different levels of power based upon the information that they have available to, or the expertise that they can bring to bear on a problem. Right. Oh, I've got lots of questions. Have I got time? Yes, I've got time still. So stakeholders have agency. That means that stakeholders are not passive. They have the option to respond and to react in ways that could have impact for you. I think that would be my simplest explanation there. In terms of the phases of intervention diagram. So the phases of intervention diagram was based upon a study of a great many operational research interventions. And Brocklesby and Mingers identified that typically the time that you spent on those 4 different activities would vary across the project. So at the outset, I'm going to see if I can go, it's a little way back, but I'm going to try and go back to the diagram. There we are. Yeah. So if you've got time along the bottom here, at the outset, you're going to spend an awful lot of your time trying to appreciate what's going on in the situation as you try to understand different people's perception or insight into the context. You may have been given a brief that the problem is of a particular type, but you want to explore that to verify really whether what you've been told at the outset is really the right problem to be exploring and is really going to set you up to do the right type of analysis. That's the next thing that you're going to be spending the majority of your time on. Then as you go through that analysis, in some projects, the sort of assessment of options may be relatively small. I think if you were creating a forecasting or prediction type model, you would make sort of choices about technically the best the best way to build your model as you were going along. So actually perhaps this assessment phase where you're making choices between the way that you produce that model for your end users might actually be quite small. But the final part, where you're taking time explaining to users how to use your model, encouraging them to actually use it, to think about extensions of how it might be applied to slightly different areas of the business or situations. That is where you're really going to be trying to get that commitment to action. So you will be spending more time on thinking about the practicalities of implementing the solution that you have produced. Right. I'm very aware here that I don't get feedback from you guys as to how you feel about my explanations. But for any of you, catch one of us in the workshops if you want further explanation. How do these link to the assignment? Right. I'm not sure whether Francis has yet released the details of the assignment. So I'm ever so sorry, but I don't feel like I can answer this question right now. I will make sure that there is an answer, because I don't want to jump the gun with telling you things about the assignment that Francis may not have had the opportunity yet to fully explain. What is the difference between the stakeholder star diagram and the power interest grid? Have I still got time? Okay, I think this might be the last question I have time for. Ooh, here we go. Okay, so the power interest grid is simply saying, how much power does this stakeholder have? How interested are they? Two stakeholders could have a similar low level of power and a high interest, perhaps different departments within an organization that are both involved in the same process. So they might be in the same place on the power interest grid. But when you think about the nuances of what their bases of power are and what their directions of interest are, that might be quite different. Yeah, so this gives you something that you can place on the grid, and you can say, okay, what sort of levels of power and interest am I dealing with from these stakeholders? The stakeholder star diagram gives you a more nuanced view of where that power comes from and how you might respond to that direction of interest. So I hope that covers it. Yes. Josh, did you spot any questions that I really ought to be addressing? Or are we good to close? Wonderful. So I think I've addressed all the questions I needed to. If I haven't, please grab me at some point, or ask one of the other tutors in the workshops, and if necessary, they'll refer you back to me. Thank you very much for joining us this morning, and I look forward to seeing some of you in the workshops this afternoon. Michael will be running the first one. I'll be running the second, and of course, Francis will, as usual, run the 2 Wednesday workshops. Thank you very much.